region, we had to make the decisions without making extricable the two most costly mistakes made by the US in the 90s. There are many others, of course, but the two most costly mistakes as regards the Middle East. Firstly, deciding to leave Saddam in power in 91, and secondly, imposing sanctions that contributed to Iraq's degradation. I mean, sanctions very rarely do damage to corrupt regimes, it has to be said. It only really does damage to the innocent victims of the regimes. We acted too late, but the longer we postponed our actions, the worse the problem would have been when we finally did intervene. I mean, it's not also very well known, but under Saddam, Iraq was gradually beginning to split along ethnic and religious lines, and it seems that this division will increase over time. The consequences for those on the wrong end of a split or a partition are evident. I mean, every time we look at India and Pakistan, we can see that. For me, the place, the region of Kashmir, most likely the catalyst for nuclear war. But there are many other Asian countries and some in Europe too who've suffered from bad partitioning. But it's true to say cowardice and short-sightedness has dominated the 90s, during which the leaders of influential nations such as our own and the US failed to react or reacted too late to the genocides, to the dictators and failed states that emerged at the end of the Cold War. Rwanda, Serbia, Kosovo and Afghanistan, and still haven't dealt with the awful regimes in North Korea, Burma, much of Africa. I mean, Burma and Zimbabwe are making the headlines at the moment, but there are many, many other cruel tyrannies which need exposing more ubiquitously. I mean, the difficulty is where do you start and where do you stop? I mean, China's probably beyond the reach. It never seems likely that any intervention would occur there. But it's an awful regime. What about the Russians in Chechnya? What about the Congolese genocide? The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka? What about Indonesia? We are paying for our reticence. The difficulties you're seeing are a result of 30 years of tyranny and oppression in Iraq. The offer of democracy is a good offer for any country, but the biggest fear must surely be that there are not enough democratically minded people in Iraq because of their shocking history. It's understandable that at the moment much of the population see our presence as a method of power grabbing, but we can help them change their views. It will take some time, but we can do it. I suppose in that sense we're a bit like the adult that was trying to squeeze the shiver out of the child's finger. You have to press on it a bit, but ultimately the pain is for the good of the child. I mean, it's true that our government made it so difficult for themselves. You know, if we had gone in under the pretext of removing Saddam and made concerted efforts to liberate Iraq, virtually nobody sane would have thought it unjust, and Tony Blair wouldn't have created half the problems for himself that he did. I mean, I plan to cover that a little bit later, actually. Perhaps the portent should be heeded. I mean, those that claim Iraq was stable before we intervened ought to think for a second what it must be like to live in a country where a great many of the inhabitants are dehumanized. To be part of a country where autocracy had ruled for too long, where each individual is seen as a property of the state, the property of a cruel dictatorship that governed by divide and rule, one would find it hard to imagine the misery invoked on these people. Saddam, a man whose regime was based in part on National Socialism and in part on an emulation of former tyrannies, had creamed the resources of his country off the poor people into his own hands. This was a country that suffered from years of oppression. They were on the verge of economic bankruptcy. They were using Xerox machines to print their own currency. They had a convertible currency, actually. A country where it was death for you if you owned a satellite dish or a cell phone, or if you were caught distributing leaflets of any kind, and not a very pleasant death either, I must say. I, for one, am glad that Saddam's tyranny has been vanquished and that a cruel dictator has been removed, along with his murdering associates. I mean, the end of this sanguinary conflict may not be on the horizon just yet, but for the time, certainly for the first time in several decades, the Iraqi people have some hope. Much of the anti-war movement has been fueled by claims that we went in on a lie, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, for example. The anti-war folk that claim we went in on a lie might have more credibility, actually, if they weren't the ones vociferously claiming in 2003 that if we went near Saddam Hussein, he would most likely unleash his weapons of mass destruction on Israel. Did Bush and Blair lie? Well, think back to the time. Virtually everybody believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. They didn't believe that Saddam was going to invade Kuwait, in fact, until it became obvious to everyone. The Americans did nothing to prevent it, could have done. A presumption of innocence would have been foolish and indeed dangerous, particularly with Saddam's track record of genocide. In 1991, Israel was a target of Iraqi Scud missiles. It didn't retaliate, but I think it's foolish to say that weapons of mass destruction and Saddam are not inextricably linked. The provenance of much of these missing weapons of mass destruction was the AQ Khan network in Pakistan, whose huge acquisition was paid for actually by the blank check that America gave them to combat the Russians. Much of which was spent building up the Taliban, ironically. Incidentally, America has been continuing to fund them in their attempts to pretend that the Taliban are their enemy, and always have been. You don't have to look very far to find these things out. These are all provable facts. Also, you don't have to look very hard to read the works of several people who served under Saddam and openly testified that he had weapons of mass destruction. The most comprehensive of which is the testimony by Georges Homissada, a retired general officer of the Iraqi Air Force, a born-again Christian. He had a book published, actually. It's called Saddam's Secrets, in which he talks about Saddam's plans to destroy Israel, his attempts to control the Arab world, and how he aspired to command and occupy much more than he did. And Mr. Sada also talks about his own role in supervising the removal of weapons of mass destruction to Damascus in Syria, because Saddam was worried that the Western troops would find them. There have been many other sources which expose Saddam's complex concealment plans. The media have nothing credible to say on this, as you can imagine. But even if it does turn out that there were never any weapons of mass destruction, although that seems highly unlikely, actually, probably more likely that we'll never find them, but it was universally accepted at the time that he did have them. Now, I have to ask, who in their right mind would risk such a blithe approach to something so serious? I think the refusal of the French and the Russians to back a second UN resolution, it did cause much international disharmony, and their actions certainly catalysed the rumour that we had overreacted, of course. But we must remember the self-serving nature of Russia and France. As both countries had vested financial interests in Iraq and didn't want to jeopardise that. But I think a chasm of tautology yawns at the feet of those who wish to have it both ways, with their gross rhetorical and argumentative excess. Of course this path will never be a smooth one. The horrors of Abu Ghraib should tell us that, the awful way that the Iraqi prisoners were treated. It's extremely difficult to ask people to clothe themselves morally if those who are making the insistences are naked themselves. But on this point of weapons of mass destruction, we do know, although we haven't perhaps been able to prove comprehensively, that Saddam Hussein's plans for weapons of mass destruction and the rest of the Middle Eastern region were enough to send a huge wave of foreboding across the waters. We also know and now have provable evidence that Saddam Hussein was in the process of buying nuclear weapons from Kim Jong-il in Syria. We can prove this. Saddam once had a reactor. Israel blew it up a while back, but we knew he was trying to acquire them. We couldn't prove it unless we went in. This whole legality factor is thrown in by the anti-war faction to help build up their weak, now moribund actually, case for objection. if there are still people who feel vindicated by their anti-war protestations, which they had back in 2000,